Hey guys, kinggath here, and welcome to Bethesda Mod School. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use grouping and randomization with conditions to make your characters more believable. So one of the things you'll find that Bethesda does throughout is puts a lot of random dialogue lines. So if you go up to them and talk to them, even if you're doing the same activity over and over again, such as going up to a shopkeeper, it's very rare that you'll hear the same line close together. If you were to go back to a shopkeeper immediately, you won't hear the same line. Maybe you'll hear the same one, a few times down the line when you go talk to them, just because you repeatedly talk to them. But generally, right real close to each other, you won't hear the same line multiple times. And the way they do this is with the randomization flag. Now, I showed this in the very first tutorial in this series, but I want to go a little bit deeper with it. So one of the things that I don't think I showed in the first one that I use extensively is the group system. Now you can see I took this line from our previous tutorial where we set up this particular quest, and I've set up a group. And there's two ways you can set up a group. One is you can go make info group, and that will create a blank group, or you can right click on an existing line and hit make info group, and then it will put it into a brand new group. So that's what I did with this. So if you double click on a group, you'll see that it brings up a screen and then the line is right there. And this is effectively just another version of this screen right here, except that it has its own set of conditions here. You can force all the children to be random or activate only. And it basically is a way so that you can easily control how a set of lines works. So for example, if we wanted to set it up so that we had one group of hellos for when you first meet a character, and then maybe after you complete a quest for them, we want to change the hellos so that they kind of recognize and acknowledge that you completed the quest, where they can, every time you go talk to them, they can say thanks again for your help, things like that. There's a lot of different stuff you can do with this, and that's all thanks to the condition system. Now, the conditions are available on lines individually. So if we open up our line here, you can see we have the same condition thing. The power here is just making it so that you only have to change things once. So let's say we had a dozen different lines here that we could randomize between, and we condition them all, is that if we then wanted to change the conditions, we would have to go back into every line individually and do that. But with the groups, we can condition once on the group itself, and then every time we want to change those conditions, it's easy to do that across the board on all those lines. So I really love groups for that. Another thing with groups that you'll want to get used to is starting to give them an ID. And this is helpful for a couple of reasons. One, it'll just let you identify them on this main topic screen, as you'll be able to see them more easily. So if we just went ahead and do KG diag hellos, we'll just call this generic, is that you can see that ID shows up right in the group label right there. So you can kind of at a glance, if you have a bunch of stuff set up, you can kind of figure out which one is which. So that's helpful. Another place that it's useful is you can actually move things between topic groups by hitting this move to. And if you don't have your group named, it can be nearly impossible to find the appropriate group in that particular screen if you start getting a lot of these groups set up. So they would just all of the blank ones will just look identical to you. So it's the ones that don't have an editor ID. So that's another place that's useful, because what you'll find when you start getting deeper into a character, especially if you're starting to do some major character work, or if you're doing like a companion and you start getting hundreds and hundreds of lines, you'll find that often you're trying to move them around, or you find one like this line I thought would work as a hello, but I think it would be better as an idle. You'll find that you're going to be moving those around a lot, and it's just nice to have an easy way to do that. So I highly recommend using groups and making sure you give them editor IDs. Even if you've only got a couple of lines, it's still useful just to future-proof for yourself. But where the real power comes in is when we start getting into conditioning and setting up stuff where we want to have randomization that happens only during a certain period of time. So think about like a major quest NPC, something in the main quest where they give you some mission to do, and every time you go up and talk to them, they ask you about the progress. They'll ask you're like, hey, did you do that thing I asked you to do? Have you heard any more about this thing? Things like that. And even within that, you might want some randomization. Maybe you don't want them to just say one sentence over and over again, because it doesn't seem very believable. You want them to have 2 or 3 options, so that way if the player goes and interacts with them before completing the quest, they'll get those responses. But then after they complete that thing, you don't want them to keep asking about it. That wouldn't feel right. So I'm going to bring up another mod that I've done where we set up something like that. And this is Franktown versus Rontown. And what we have is, in this mod, if you haven't played with it, there's a couple of characters that will show up after you capture Starlight or Sunshine Tidings. And when they talk to you, they give you some tasks. They're not really quests, but they're set up virtually as quests. And until you complete them, they just have some lines they randomize between. So, for example, when you first meet Frank, he gives you this little mission to make him the leader of the settlement, which is a feature of some settlements. And Then if you go talk to him again, he's going to start asking you, like what the holdup is. Like, why haven't you just made me the leader? Because it's such an easy process. And so he has these 3 lines that he randomizes between. And you can see I have them conditioned that it's saying is stage 10 of this quest done, that means he's introduced. But has he been made the city leader is 0. So that stage hasn't happened yet. So as soon as this stage is done, this will evaluate to false, and all these lines will be ineligible to be spoken anymore. So he's only going to randomize between these 3 lines during that time period before you actually make him the leader. So the idea there is he gives you that thing, and then if you just decide, no, I'm not going to do that, then every time you go back to him, so say you go play the game and you come back, he's going to kind of remind you, like, hey, yeah, remember that thing I mentioned to you? And then again, we do that same type of thing here. Then he asks you to use his faction to control your army, and until you do, he's going to keep randomizing between these. And then again, that becomes ineligible as soon as stage 40 would evaluate to 1. So once stage 40 is complete, and that means the faction was used, then these lines get disabled, and then it will fall back to our default set. So that is one of the great ways to use groups in a way that makes sense. Now, one thing we got to talk about here that's very important is outside of conditioning, there's also an issue of priority. This is one of the more complicated parts of dialogue, and it gets really complicated when you start setting up stuff at the level Bethesda does. So one exercise I would highly recommend you guys do as you're getting into dialogue and you're trying to learn more is do a search for dialogue under the quests. So I'm under character quest here, and you'll see that there are just probably 200 quests. I don't know how many there are. There's just dozens and dozens of them. But they're different quests, and they have various amounts of dialogue in them. But what you'll find is that a lot of these apply to multiple, or a lot of NPCs will have their dialogue spread across probably dozens of quests. And this can get very confusing as to how do they decide what to speak. So let's say you're walking up to an NPC and you activate them and you expect them to speak a hello line. Well, knowing which one they're going to speak can be a challenge, especially when you start getting into this complicated stuff. So there's a couple of different things that determine the priority of which line is going to be spoken. So the first one is actually the priority of the quest. So if there's a whole bunch of different quests that the NPC has eligible lines for, the priority of the quest will determine which one they speak often. So if you have them, so one of the ways this can be used is for, if you think about, an NPC that's part of the main quest. So like Father, for example, during that particular quest, while that quest is active and you want those lines to supersede all their generic dialogue, you just would jack up the priority on that major quest, knowing that once that quest shut down, all that dialogue is going to be disabled, and then they'll resort to whatever's on their lower priority quest. So that's one of the things is you'll find if you look through a lot of these, their priority on this generic dialogue stuff will tend to be quite low on some of them. So this is a bad example. Obviously, neighborhood entrance probably has something particular in it. Let's see. Let's go to generic NPCs. See, like this generic NPCs, it's down at 30. So things that are quest related or specific scenes, like I think that entrance is probably that little event that triggers when you walk into Good Neighbor and the guy tries to rob you, and spoiler alert, and then Hancock comes in, so that's probably what that's related to. But anyway, you'll find that Bethesda uses this pretty heavily. They'll have their priority set up. In fact, you can look at this priority column and you can see there's quite the gambit here, from as low as 5 up to 90. So you can use the priority on the quest itself as one way to condition. Another way that it uses is once it determines which quest to pull dialogue from, it then goes, then whatever topic it's going to speak. So if the game's looking for a hello to speak, it then actually just goes top to bottom here. So the actual order these things appear here actually matters quite a bit. So one of the points that's very important to know is if you have unconditioned dialogue or very easily conditioned dialogue. So stuff that you anticipate will be active most of the time. So I'm going to use my Franktown versus Roundtown here. And before I go even further, I'm going to show you guys how you reorganize this. So if you have dialogue that's not in an order that you're happy with, if you select I don't know if I can do it from this screen. Let's try. If you select a line and you use the left and right arrow keys, yeah, it does work here. It'll move the dialogue. Same thing with the groups. If I push the left and right arrow keys, it moves it around in here. So that's how you sort that. And that, I don't think that's documented anywhere. I just stumbled upon that by accident one day when I was getting frustrated trying to reorganize my dialogue. And so left and right arrow keys will reorganize the dialogue. But one of the places where this is really important that you do it in a particular order is stuff like I just described here. So we have these sets of dialogue that we want to be spoken only in these very specific conditions, when this quest is in a certain state, when it's waiting for the player to do something. Well, if we look at our generic hellos, so that's just what I named my group for the generic ones. I just didn't put anything. Sometimes I'll add on the end there generic. And by the way, the format that I've used for this, you can use whatever you want, but it does follow the same rules as naming any editor ID. So when you set up forms, generally when I've walked you guys through setting up things, I always have you fill out this ID as the very first step you do. These follow those same rules, so they have to be absolutely unique, and I recommend starting with your prefix. It's not required, and you don't have to do this big long thing like I've done. Like I tend to always follow this format of my prefix, then the word dialogue, then the character it's for, then I use the topic, and then sometimes I'll put a little sub thing if there's information. So for example, you can see in these, I used the specific case, like what is happening right now when they're speaking these. This is the actual editor ID that you use is totally up to you. It's really just for organization, but it does have to be unique. So in the case of these, or if we go back to our hellos here, you can see this is unconditioned. So this stuff is always eligible to be spoken. So that's a problem if I only want this stuff for the quest to be spoken, because what's going to happen is when it's eligible for the NPC to speak a hello, it's going to grab the first eligible lines. So it's going to go through and check this group. It's going to see, okay, if this quest, so say these are eligible, say stage 10 is done, but stage 20 is not done, which means it's going to pick from one of these lines. And then as soon as it picks a line, it exits, and it doesn't continue to have them, because obviously when you have the NPC speak a hello, you don't want it to then speak a whole bunch of stuff right here, unless that's what scenes are for, which we'll cover in a future video, probably the next one. But you generally, once it picks a line, then it exits out, and then the next time that it's eligible for a hello line, it's going to follow the exact same process to choose priority. So what would end up happening, let's say we had our hellos here up at the top. Since this is always eligible because there's no conditions on it, it's never ever going to get to these groups, and these are never going to happen. So for that reason, you're going to want to either put your stuff that's super generic on a very low priority quest, or if you want to do like I've done and keep your character dialogue for each character all on the same quest, is you just sort these by using the arrow keys here, and just make sure that your least conditioned stuff is at the bottom and that your most conditioned stuff is toward the top. And that way you can be certain that it'll trigger. So I actually, looking at this now, I don't know if this is, because I actually was playing around with this off camera trying to come up with a script for this lesson and everything. And I very well may have deleted some conditions off of here. But if this is how the live thing is set up, it's actually in such a state that this stuff will never be spoken, because these hellos. Oh, no, I'm wrong. I'll show you guys why in a second. But at a glance, it looked like that once it got to these hellos, none of these other stuff would actually be spoken. But here's another thing you can do that's very useful. So we talked about, or I believe I have talked about this force all children random. If I haven't, now I'm doing so. And basically what that does is it's the equivalent of going to each of your lines and checking in this random box. And you can see that it's actually grayed out. And that's because it's basically telling you that this force all children random is on. So all of these lines are random. Well, that means the lines within the group itself are randomized. But another thing you can do is you can actually randomize the group itself by this random box up here. So when we do something like that, when we have multiple groups with random, then when the game goes in and it says, okay, we need a hello line. We've determined that this is the quest we're going to use. So now it checks these. It sees this one. Okay, the quest has already passed this. This one's not eligible. It's past this point. This one's not eligible either. So now we're to this one. Well, we see the game sees this random flag. So then it's going to go check, wait, are there any other with random as well? So then it goes to this one. It sees, yep, this one's random as well. Goes down to this one. Yep, this one's also random. So it's like, okay, well, now we can choose randomly between any of these three groups. So then it'll pick one of the groups at random, and then it will, assuming that the conditions are met. So it will check those. But if you didn't have these random boxes on, as soon as it got to an eligible group, it would stop looking for others. Having that random box means it's also going to check the others. So it'll check the conditions on these and see if they're eligible. So this one didn't have any conditions. I think on this particular one, I think each of the lines has conditions, but I don't recall. Again, could be a bug in the mod. I don't know. But if you don't have that random flag checked in, it's just going to stop immediately. It won't even bother checking any of the conditions past that. So it's really important, but it's a really powerful feature again. So I'll leave it to you guys to dig into a lot of Bethesda stuff to see how it's done. The way I've done it in Franktown versus Runtown is not the only way to do it. There's a million different ways to do this. This is the beauty of the way the creation kit is set up with this condition system, is you can do it so many different ways. This is a way I like to do it. Taking advantage of I put my things that are very specific up toward the top, and then the things that don't have conditions or are not that important to the particular scenario. So this post-battle stuff, this is things that will happen. So since this is designed to work with Conqueror, we have in Sim Settlements Conqueror, there's a lot of battles going on. You're constantly going to have your guys either attacking or being attacked, and so like we had a lot of commentary about what happened during the battle. And so, but that stuff we still want to be intermixed with the general hellos. Like we don't want him always just commenting on the battle. But if you want stuff to be higher priority and where you want it to happen, and like I said, the best examples I can come up with are very specific quest stages. You have a quest that just happened, or you're waiting for the player to do a part for a quest. To make it feel realistic, you want the NPC to talk about that particular thing exclusively. And so then that's where these conditions and the order of this grouping can come into play. So there's so many different ways you can play with this. Hopefully I've given you guys some ideas of how you could use this. The conditions are with the groups is a great thing. You can even do conditioning on individual lines. So if we go into our idols here, you'll see that I actually have set up different idols to speak based on which shop they're working. So if Frank is working a particular shop type at a settlement, he will yell really loud to try and get you to come shop, kind of like he's a bark. We call them barks. So it's similar to how you would feel if you walk into Diamond City. You'll hear like the guy selling the swatters trying to lure you in. We have something like that set up for Franktown versus Rontown. And one of the things we do in here, if you look at these idols, is we've got all these different conditions set up, and the children random. And so this is another powerful thing you can do with this. So we group them just to make it easier so I can see at a glance which ones are for which. But one of the things, let's see, I think it's bartender idols. One of these I have set up with some sub lines. Okay, it's not in this section. It's under Notice Corpses where. So apologies. But anyway, this is something I wish more NPCs in the game did, because I really love that feeling from Diamond City. It would be nice to have it in settlements. But anyway, so where I actually meant to show you was Notice Corpse. So Notice Corpse is the NPC sees a dead body and they're going to comment on it. This is something Bethesda does a lot of. I really love it. I think it makes a lot of sense that people would be concerned if there were dead bodies. Even in a post-apocalyptic scenario, you still don't want to see your friends die. So one of the things you can do here, so we have all these children randomized. We could have had conditions here, but I didn't. Instead, I've got the conditions on the different Notice Corpse lines. So, for example, this one, Impossible, the Dank Boys are unkillable. This will only come up, and I have the individual line conditioned, if the target, so this is one thing that's interesting about Notice Corpse. The NPC will have a target while they're doing Notice Corpse, so you can comment on the particular corpse. And there are two ways to do this. One is, it depends on the condition, but one of the easiest ways to do it is to just select Run on Target. So generally, subject is selected by default, and in the case of dialogue, subject means the person speaking, but in this case, target, they'll have a target, and then whatever condition you want here. So there's tons of stuff within condition. In this case, we want him to comment only if the body he found is in his own faction. Then he's going to make this statement. Another one I like to use with Notice Corpse in particular is I think it's target faction relation. Here it is. So this is another way target comes into play, is that sometimes target is the default of the condition. So for faction relation, you're saying is subject's faction relation to target, and then it's this number. This number is something I looked up on the Creation Kit site. For conditions, one thing to know is that they are not documented on the Fallout 4 Creation Kit site, but they are on the Skyrim side. So if you're trying to look up what a condition does or how it works specifically, just go to creationkit.com, click on Skyrim, and search up the condition. Almost all of them are available for Skyrim and Fallout 4. There's probably a few that aren't, but they are documented much better on the Skyrim wiki. And I think it's 1 means enemy. So basically, and 0 is neutral or something like that. I don't remember what it was, but I'd basically determine if it's less than 2, that's an enemy. I want them to be kind of dismissive of them. Whereas if it's a friendly, so in this case, we're going to need some more turret towers. He's saying we need more defense. So if it's greater than or equal to 2, so I think 2 might be friendly, 3 is ally maybe, that then he'll comment on something more about defenses. So you can do stuff like that. You can individually condition the lines, but also have conditions on the group itself. And you can use all of these different things in combination. So you can use the the ordering to get priority, the conditioning. You can do randomization on the group itself, but then have individual lines with their own conditions. It's a very powerful system. It takes a while to wrap your head fully around, but I think if you just look at it from the perspective of top down, it's going to check each group for conditions. As soon as it finds an eligible one, it's going to stop there unless you have random checked. Then it will go forward and check any others that have random to see if they're conditions. And then once it finds all of them, all of the groups with eligible conditions, it then picks a group at random and then follows the same flow of logic, checking the rules in that one. Now, I believe, so if we go back to our Notice Corpse example, I believe if it, say, for example, say we had multiple groups here, or we'll go back to hellos. I think this is the best spot. Okay, so let's say that it determined we had all of these at random. And it determined that it was going to use this group, and then it went in and checked each of the lines, and each of these conditions were false. It would then back out again and choose one of the other ones. So it's smart enough to do that. So you don't have to worry about over conditioning. You can kind of go nuts with the conditioning. So if you have lines that are meant for this very specific scenario, don't feel bad about conditioning them that way. I would say that you can go too far. So one of the things I'm sure you've all run into is that the settlers tend to start sounding monotonous. Like you hear them saying the same things over and over again. Part of that is because Bethesda over-conditioned a lot of their lines. They actually have a crazy number of lines, several hundred, and a lot of them are just so specific you just never hear them. So there is a reason not to do that. But on the other side is that it feels really good as a player when when an NPC comments on something very particular. It just makes them feel more alive. So I tend to lean toward way more dialogue than is probably necessary, which is why, just for these like little sections of quest, which, most players probably complete very quickly, they've got 3 lines of randomization for each. I think that just feels a lot better. It makes them feel like real people as opposed to NPCs. We don't want them to feel just like robots. We want them to feel like we can get fully lost in and loving these characters. Or if you're a Skyrim fan, if you go look at the amount of dialogue in the Inigo mod, it's nuts. Just thousands and thousands of hellos and idols, all randomized on very specific conditions, and it just feels really good. So I encourage that, but these are some tools to help you get to that. So these randomization and conditions, this is going to be your bread and butter for making these characters come to life. Now, obviously, the big thing we haven't talked about yet as far as dialogue is scenes. I will try and make that the next tutorial, because that is going to lead us to connect back to our quest series, so you guys can see how you have NPCs that offer up quests and everything. But I think just with this information based on hellos and idols and things like that, and using these various topics, I believe in the first tutorial of Dialogue 101, I went over a bunch of these different groups and how you might use them. If you want more information, again, I'd always recommend digging into either Bethesda stuff or a mod like Franktown versus Runtown to see the groups that they're using, so you can kind of get some ideas. There's a lot of them that Bethesda uses that I find unnecessary. So if you look at the NPC stuff I do, it tends to be what I think is worth doing, because I want if we're going to put in the effort to have people for free recording these lines, that we want to maximize the output. So we want as many lines as possible to be heard. So that's how I tend to do it. But if you're looking to go all out and you want to put in that level of polish, like something like Inigo or some of Bethesda's deeper characters like their companions, then you can use a lot more of the groups than you'll see that I do. And that's where, again, I would think about an NPC that you love, whether it be in a mod or in the base game, and the depth that they go to, and go look at their dialogue quests. And they'll tend to have the name right in the quest name that holds them all, and you can dig in and start looking at all these and finding out where it is. And it'll probably be spread across multiple quests. So just be aware of that. I think that about covers it. I think the only thing we didn't talk about regarding this grouping, randomization, priority conditioning and stuff is this priority field up at the top of the topic. I'm not exactly certain how to make use of this. I haven't found a lot of examples, although I haven't really looked for a lot of examples of where the priorities are changed in these individual things. I tend to just leave it alone anyway, and I don't think I'd want to mess with it, because it tends to be that the game's going to have these various conditions that are going to happen in gameplay. So, for example, a character is going to be bleeding out. That's a very specific condition. I don't need them to comment on being hit while they're already bleeding out. So I believe you could set up the priority on some of these individual topics so that they get higher priority when the game's trying to decide what to say. But I don't know how that would work within things, because I don't know about how the event code that determines when a line should be spoken, because that's all controlled at a level that we don't have access to. So I don't know how this affects that. You can experiment with that, see if maybe it makes some of those lines be spoken more if you want. But I tend to find that I would rather leave this priority alone and just give the control at the group level instead, rather than trying to mess with the game's logic about which groups to speak. I just like to accept the fact that, it's going to, when an NPC gets hit, it's going to trigger this. And then you can do things like set, you'll see that a lot of times Bethesda will take lines when NPCs are hit, and they will put a percent chance on it. I don't remember the exact condition they use for that. You can go dig in and you'll see that, where it makes it so that maybe specific lines that are very specific. So like, for example, if you look at Frank here, actuaries are starting to leak. That's a very specific line. You'd notice that if it got said a lot. So you could condition that so that it was spoken much less by using a random percentage on it, so that it was like make it roll a die, essentially like a 1 out of 10 chance that one would be spoken, where it would lean more toward these more generic ones that you wouldn't think twice about if you heard them repeatedly. But anyway, like I'm saying, there's so much depth to this system. I hope I've given you guys the tools to go reverse engineer things, is what I'm getting at. So I'll stop rambling now. Stay tuned for the next week's episode. Hopefully we'll get into dialogue scenes, and then I want to jump back to the quest series and get you guys tying these two things together so you're fully equipped to go start making epic quest mods.